Visual Studio has come a long way since it was first introduced way back in 1997, and especially since the integration of the .NET framework in 2002. Every release of Visual Studio has come with major productivity enhancements and analysis and debugging tool advancements, as well as additional language support based on industry trends and developer needs. Visual Studio 2017 is no exception. VS 2017 is now the first release of Visual Studio in the new open Microsoft world. Whether you're a web and cloud developer, a corporate Office and SharePoint developer, an old school Windows desktop developer, or even a game designer or data scientist, Visual Studio 2017 is the new gold standard. I'm Scott J. Peterson, and this is what's new and improved in Visual Studio 2017. For this session, we'll be reviewing what's new and improved with Visual Studio 2017 Release Candidate 1. However, most of what we cover in this session should apply through the entire release candidate cycle and the final product release of Visual Studio 2017. Visual Studio 2017 is the first release of Visual Studio that bills itself as targeting any developer for any type of app on any platform. We'll be using Visual Studio 2017 Enterprise Edition, but much of what we cover will apply to other editions of Visual Studio 2017 as well. To get the most out of this session, I recommend installing Visual Studio 2017 Release Candidate in one of these three editions. As mentioned, I'll be using the Enterprise Edition, but you can get the fully featured IDE available free in the Community Edition. This is a great scenario for students and individual developers. And there's also a Professional Edition that has some additional benefits if you're working in a team. Now, quite honestly, Visual Studio 2017 ships with thousands of new features and enhancements. What we're going to cover in this session is some of the more common scenarios, the things that most developers would care about across workloads and across projects. And here's really the way that we're going to break this down. We're going to talk about the new Visual Studio installation user experience, really cool workload-based experience. And then we're going to talk about some new features of the IDE, of the Visual Studio environment itself, and then step into a bunch of cool enhancements in debugging and debugging concepts that can really expedite your debugging experience. And then we'll go into really my favorite section in this session, which is all the new enhancements around IntelliSense and refactoring. Some very cool stuff, including some new XAML related items that I think that you'll be pretty impressed by. And then finally, we're going to talk about some things that the Visual Studio team has done related to projects and publishing, specifically things like legacy desktop app publishing, UWP publishing, things that are related to XAML, like the new XAML Edit and Continue, and a couple of the new publishing updates, including some of the new concepts in publishing .NET Core apps using Docker Hubs and pushing content out to Linux. So with that being said, let's just flip on over and get started taking a look at the new Visual Studio 2017 installation process. So we're over here in the Visual Studio 2017 installer, and you'll notice that the user experience looks totally different. And the install experience in Visual Studio 2015 and earlier was actually a pretty good install experience, but there was typically a very long install process, and for a lot of developers it was difficult to understand which pieces and which dependencies were required as they were walking through this process. The Visual Studio team has really put a lot of focus on making sure that developers can understand what they need to install based on the type of development they want to do. In fact, these are really categorized in some great new groupings called workloads. So you'll see, for example, on this Workloads tab, I've got 3 or 4 different groupings, and in each of these groupings, we've got a workload. So, for example, in the Windows workload, I've got UWP development, .NET desktop development, which is really legacy Windows development, and desktop development with C++. Since I do UWP development as well as things like WPF and Windows Forms development, I've selected those 2 workloads. And when these workloads are selected, all of the dependent components will be installed based on the type of development I choose to do. And this will be the same for web and cloud, mobile and gaming, and other tool sets. For example, if I want to create extensions for Visual Studio, I can just select the Visual Studio extension development, or Linux development with C++, I can select it there. The important things to note here is that when you select these workloads, all of the dependent components will be installed for you. And if they're shared dependencies, these will be selected. In fact, if we go over to the summary and expand the nodes, we can see the specific components that are going to be installed. And we can say, hey, wait a minute, this is going to install for Azure Development, but I want Azure Cloud Services, or I also want the Azure Storage Emulator, and we could add those in as well. And it's going to make sure that we have everything that we need for those specific types of development. But we can also drill down into individual components. For example, if based on our workloads, it says that we need the .NET Core Runtime and then these .NET Framework SDKs and targeting packs, we could say, wait a minute, I know I need .NET Framework 3.5 development tools, and we could select it there. We could say, I know I need the Azure Cloud Services, I need the Data Lake tools, I need the Cloud Explorer. And we can add these additional individual components based on what our development preferences are. And now this is actually helpful if we have some older solutions that we're maintaining, and we'll say, in general, I'm a UWP developer, I'm a mobile developer, but I know I'm going to have to support, for example, an older Xamarin tool set. So we could go in and select different Android emulators and work through it that way. We could also say, I'm not sure that I'm totally comfortable installing an entire workload, but I'd like to check out the Visual Studio tools for Unity. This doesn't mean I'm going to install the entire workload, but I'm just going to check out the tools for Unity. This may be helpful, for example, in some of the data scientist things like our services, where you just really want to get familiar with something, but you don't want to install all the dependencies. The other great thing about the new Visual Studio 2017 installer is that I can also install all of these additions side by side. So in this example, I'm using the Visual Studio Enterprise installation, but I could also install the Community Edition and the Professional Edition, and they would run side by side, and I could load up and evaluate different versions. And the great thing here is it's going to be really easy to uninstall. There's a much smaller footprint for the installation. It's much faster. In fact, I don't know what the specific percentages are, but I know in my experience, when I have to uninstall and reinstall or install on different workstations, the installation process is much faster. This is not a half-a-day process by any means, including scenarios where we have to modify or do repairs for some reason as we're working through some experimentation. So let's flip back over and take a look at some of the stuff that gets installed, and especially let's look at some of the cool new enhancements in the Visual Studio 2017 IDE itself. Okay, we're over here in Visual Studio 2017 to look at a few of the cool new features in the IDE or in the environment itself. And for this example, I've got two projects loaded in a solution. The projects are called FactMaster. This is a simple Universal Windows Platform app, UWP app, and a .NET Core web solution. And one cool new feature is this new idea of go to all. So if I were to say edit, go to all, or simply use the shortcut Control T, we now have the ability to find content across our solution, not just based on a name, but also on the type of object or file it is. So if I were to type in fact, you see that we have this list where we've got these types or classes called fact, we have these files called fact, we have these user interface elements, I have this fact label, it shows us where it exists, but we can also filter these. So for example, I can say show me just types, and then I've got just these classes that exist that are a fact, or I could say show me only files, and you'll see that I've got these fact.cs, I've got a fact helper, we've got some files associated with that. I could even have it show specific lines, so fact on line 1. And this makes it really easy to find content across your solution and then filter it down to get to exactly what you might need. Now, this may not be a big deal if you just have one project, but if you have potentially 5, 6, 10 or more projects in your solution, you're trying to find exactly what you need, this makes it extremely helpful. There's some other things we can do to filter this as well, so it's a great little thing to experiment with. One other thing I wanted to point out is this new concept of structure guides. And this is something that has been available using extensions or add-ins with Visual Studio 2015, but it's now available as part of the default installation. So you'll notice here that we've got these bracketed sections here, and this is super common as you're going through your code to have these bracketed sections. Depending on the quality of the code that you're maintaining or writing, may be a little bit difficult to see where the beginning and end sections are for those. Visual Studio 2015 now has these dotted gray lines that go between brackets that show the guide for that structure. And you'll see that this happens at every level regardless of the nesting. So you could have gotten add-ins in Visual Studio 2015 or enhancements to add these, but this is in here by default, which is pretty cool. Another thing that I wanted to look at is the new enhancements to Find All and Find References. So if I were to right-click over Root Frame and say Find All References, now this may look a little similar to earlier versions, but you'll see that I've actually got color coding and highlighting here. I can also say how I want to show items, like, for example, to group it by definition, project, and path. You'll see that I see the full path, how many items are in there. And of course, if this was a complex solution, this could be critical in being able to find the references and navigate to those references directly. Of course, you also see that we've got a great little pop-up preview for every one of those items. And I could also, if I want to, keep these results. So if I want to keep these find results available, this is something that's kind of neat, because in the past you do find all references and then you go to a reference and then those might disappear and then you'll have to go back and do a new find. With this scenario in Visual Studio 2017, we can just keep those results. So that's pretty cool. Another neat thing that we've got in Visual Studio is some changes to extensions. So not only has the format of the VSIX changed a little bit, but we now have something I wanted to point out is this new Roaming Extensions Manager. So you'll notice extensions and updates in this release is actually right at the top of Tools. But you see that we've got this new item, Roaming Extension Manager, available. And this is cool because now we can roam our extensions across devices based on our Visual Studio login or logins. And I say logins because now Visual Studio 2017 allows us to have a kind of a unified sign-in experience. So we can be logged into GitHub, we can be logged into TFS, we can be logged into Azure, we can be logged into a corporate account, for example, at Office 365 or SharePoint Online, or a Microsoft account. We can be logged into all of these accounts at one time and not have to continue to put in our credentials. One of the benefits of that is these new roaming extension concepts. So if you're like me, especially if you're doing a lot of development with third-party tools or Xamarin stuff or some of these legacy tools, you may have a number of extensions that you'd like to be in place in all of your environments. With the new Roaming Extension Manager, you can simply select one and you can select to roam or to stop roaming those extensions across your environment. So you'll see, for example, the GitHub extension for Visual Studio is currently roaming, and I can toggle that depending on what I need. And this makes it really easy as I'm going to different environments, especially if I'm a consultant and I'm going to different scenarios or different clients, and I want to have the same extensions available no matter where I go in my environment. They'll be available for me. Another thing that I wanted to look at is really focused on this idea of large projects. Typically corporate environment, but you could still have these large projects. It's not unusual in real world medium to large scale enterprise development to have solutions that will have 20, 40, 50, or even upwards of 100 projects in a single solution. And for various reasons, this may be important, but all you care about is maybe one project or two or specific files in a project or two. And in the past, you would have had to load up the entire solution with all of these projects. There may be problems with some of those projects, and then wait for all of that to happen and to compile before you're able to work on anything. Well, Visual Studio 2017 introduces this new concept of lightweight solution load. And if we were to select that, essentially what's going to happen is there's going to be a pointer that gets connected to those projects, and you're only going to have to pull up those projects if you actually need something in the project itself. So you could have basically 100 projects in a solution, and the lightweight solution load only load up what you need when you need it. Huge time saver when you have a lot of projects in a solution. Another thing I want to look at is this new idea of service capabilities. You'll notice that we've got in both of these projects, in fact, this is almost always true for any project type, not every project type, but most project types, this new service capabilities that shows up underneath the project file itself. This is kind of the next release of connected services. In fact, this kind of pulls up the connected services dialog. And the idea behind service capabilities is that you're going to connect to some known service, and that known service is going to possibly have NuGet packages or other dependencies, files that need to get installed, readmes or startups that get created or folders that get created. The service capabilities node lets us add compliant services into our project and handle this all in kind of a wizard-based scenario. So in this UWP app, if I were to pull up service capabilities and say add service capabilities, you see that I've got Hockey app, Azure Mobile Apps, and Office 365 APIs. So if I were to pull up and want to add a service capability to Office 365 APIs, for example, I just pull that up, load a domain, and add the Office 365 APIs that way. And what's going to happen is it'll actually create a structure, create a folder, create some help documentation for me, a bunch of getting started stuff. In fact, in a lot of scenarios, it'll even give me filler code or skeleton code or even fairly fleshed out code that I can just use for that new connected service. Same thing will happen if I had an Azure mobile app. I could connect to a service or create an Azure mobile app service directly from here. The other cool thing is I could say find more services, and this will actually pull up from the Visual Studio gallery all of the published connected services that have been made available for this project type. So this is a good opportunity for developers to create their own connected services and publish those out there for other developers to reuse. And I think that we can see this connected services getting extended throughout the lifetime of Visual Studio as it's a pretty powerful way to bring in these services. And of course, this is going to be project type specific. So if I go to this .NET Core app and say add service capability, you'll notice that I've got Azure Storage available. So there's certain things that could be available based on the dependencies and the targeted platforms that may work or not work in certain project types. And the service capabilities is smart enough to know that. Okay, so another thing I wanted to look at for these two specific projects is this idea of consolidated dependencies. And that's really my term, consolidated dependencies. But what that means is that all of the dependencies are going to fall under this single node now. So we're all familiar with using NuGet package management in earlier versions of Visual Studio, and that's great, and that's still in place. But for example, in this .NET Core solution, we're managing kind of server-side dependencies and client-side dependencies as well. And there's a number of different package managers we can use. We can use NPM. In this example, I've got Bower as a package manager. And you'll notice now if I expand dependencies, I see that I can manage NuGet packages and Bower dependencies from the same node. Now, in previous versions of Visual Studio 2015, this might have been available for you, but it would have been in a different file or a different folder. You would have had to go and look for this and find it somewhere else. Now, Visual Studio 2017 has made it easier to go directly under dependencies and say manage Bower packages. So I could say, I want Bootstrap, jQuery, I want to have Ajax support, I want to have Drop Zone, whatever client-side Bower packages I want to manage, I can just do it right from here. And on the note of packages, one thing that I want to point out that has changed for .NET Core while we're in here. So you'll see in this UWP app, I still have a project.json. A lot of things have transitioned to using project.json. And if you're a developer like me, you've gotten used to and have kind of fallen in love with project.json. This is still used almost everywhere, but it is no longer used for .NET Core apps. So if we go down to this .NET Core app, you'll notice that I do not have a project.json. For this release, and this may be the permanent resting place, I don't know. But for this release, all of the project.json, which is typically for most people NuGet package assembly references, is now managed within the project file itself. So if I were to go and say edit that project, you'll see that I now have package references that exist in an item group. This is just something to keep in mind if you're bringing in older .NET Core projects, or you're creating a new .NET Core project and you want to do a restore and you kind of freak out thinking, hey, where in the heck is this project.json? It's not there, but you can definitely go into your project file and take a look at all of those package references. And if I were to go to NuGet and add additional packages, it would add them here instead of into the project.json. All right, so a lot of cool little handy things here, especially related to the way that large solutions are loaded and being able to find things across large solutions. I specifically like the go to all a lot. I really like the idea of remote extension management. One other thing that I want to look at before we go into some other areas is this new idea of opening a folder. So in general, in Visual Studio, everything was kind of done on an SLN or a proj basis. You opened a solution or you opened a project. But now with the introduction of VS Code and this idea of using the CLI to create things, Visual Studio 2015 has added this new concept of open a folder. So you could say file open folder, and this isn't just going to open the folder itself, but it's actually going to understand if this is a solution without an SLN file or a project without a proj file, and give you the ability to manage that project from a simple folder open. So just to demonstrate this, let's just go out using the .NET command line interface, or CLI. We could just say simply md factbot to create a factbot directory. We would go into that directory, and then we could just open up Visual Studio Code by saying code dot. It's going to open up Visual Studio to that solution. Of course, this is just creating an empty folder. I could just say add app.js, and we could just simply write something like console.log, and we'll say I'm the factbot. And notice if we go to run this here, we can just say debug, Node.js, close, we'll run that there. And notice that we're now running that, listening on port 47137. I'm the factbot, so it logged that to the console. Okay, that's great, but let's just close that down. And let's just do a new open folder, and we'll select that factbot. And notice that we now have that solution in there, and I can select startup item as that app.js, just run it this way. And so that's pretty cool if you're used to using the CLI, or you're doing stuff with the new Visual Studio for Mac, or you just like doing it from more of a lightweight IDE. You can then go ahead and bring all of that content back into Visual Studio 2017, and it works just great. So let's take a look at one more cool thing before we get into looking at some of the enhancements for Visual Studio 2017 for debugging. Let's take a look at what the Visual Studio team is calling in-product acquisition. So if we go back to that FactMaster solution, let's say we're working in the solution and we need some support for something that has not been installed yet. For example, we were working in a UWP app, or we're working in an older Windows Phone 8.1 solution and we need 8.1 support. Or let's say we want to add Python support to our .NET Core app. We know that this is not installed, or we're having some issues finding the template or some other support. We can simply go to the quick launch now and type in, for example, Python. And notice how we have this new group that shows up that's install, and we actually see install Python web support, IoT support, native development tools. This is not the same as just adding a NuGet package. This is actually running the piece of the installer that would install Python support for this. So this is pretty cool. This gives us the ability to sort of move forward through the installation with confidence, knowing that at any time, if we need to, we can go back and add just those components, just those workloads, just those pieces that we need, and we know that the installer is going to handle it without a problem. We can also just search for templates directly from the start page as well. So now that we walked through some of the new and improved features of the IDE and the environment itself, let's talk about some enhancements to Visual Studio 2017 in the areas of debugging. So we're back over in Visual Studio 2017, and I just want to take a look at 3 or 4 cool new or improved features of Visual Studio 2017 around debugging. The first one that I want to look at is actually my favorite for this release. It's something that most developers have wanted for, years and years, maybe even decades. And it's this idea of setting temporary breakpoints and stepping through content all the time Visual Studio 2017 now adds this new concept of run to click. So if we were to put a breakpoint there, this is just in the UWP app in the app.xaml.cs. We'll put a breakpoint at the onLaunched. We'll load that up. And let's just say I wanted to see what happens at this line of code. Normally I would just have to step through all the lines of code. Now this is very simplified. When we're calling other methods, other assemblies, this can get really annoying having to step through all of these lines of code, or we would just stick a breakpoint here. But really, a lot of times all we want to do is we want to execute that code once and then stop and see what happens. So Visual Studio 2017 introduces this cool run to click feature. So when I click this little green icon that shows up next to a line of code, it'll just run the execution of the code right to there. So that's pretty cool. So if we take a look at this UWP app, it's very simplified. I've just got this button that says get a fact. And if I click the button, it's just going to call and return a fact. You are about 1 centimeter taller in the morning than in the evening. Okay, so that's interesting. But let's see what happens when I introduce an error into that logic. So if we go to that main page that pulls that up, I've got this apply formatting method, and you'll notice that this line of code in apply formatting says today's date equals date time parse 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the count. So that's obviously not going to parse. Let's pull that up and run that code, and let's see what's going to happen now with the new exception handler. We'll remove that breakpoint there. Okay, so you see that we break on that exception, but we now have this new dialog that we can edit conditions. So not only can we pin this for later, we can copy the details and view the details easier, way easier than in 2015. Open the exception settings. But I love this conditions dialog. So now we can say only break when the module name is equal to or not equal to, for example, and these you can add more conditions for this. You could also say, use a wildcard here and say, only break or never break if this is star.sumassembly.dll or whatever. So this makes it really easy to just only pay attention to exceptions coming from certain assemblies or ignore them from certain assemblies. And I have this happen all the time where I know it's going to have an error in development. It's just going to happen, and I always have to put in some line of code or whatever. So that's really cool. Another thing that I like here is this new idea of being able to attach to processes easier. I'm going to comment that out. And I'm just going to show this real quick. So if I go to say debug attached to process now, this happens a lot. I used to have to do this a lot with .NET Core stuff. I still have to do this if I have secondary or tertiary assemblies that I'm trying to connect to. But we now have this ability to filter the available processes. This seems like a minor thing, but it's actually a pretty big deal where I can just start typing in and attach to a process. It's going to save whatever I enter here for this query so that every time I open this up, it's going to stay there if I want it to. It's also going to let me reattach. So if I've attached to something, for example, this apoint.exe, when I come back in here, I can do a reattach to it, which is really cool. One other thing I want to make a note of that I'm not going to show around debugging is this idea of opening in a folder that we looked at earlier, where I can just create a solution in VS Code or through the CLI, and I can bring that project in. Well, I can configure the debugging, the IntelliSense and the debugging and everything based on the tasks.json and launch.json, just like I could in VS Code as well. So those are a couple of really cool things around debugging. There are a number of other things that are improved. Performance is greatly improved. But let's flip over and take a look at one of my favorite sections for new features and improvements in Visual Studio 2017, and that's the new enhancements in IntelliSense and refactoring. Okay, we're back over in Visual Studio 2017 to take a look at some of the cool new features and improvements around IntelliSense and refactoring. First thing I want to look at that you may have noticed as I've been typing already earlier in this session is how smart the autocomplete is now in Visual Studio 2017. So for example, if I was looking for a date and time, in older versions I could put in date, time, and of course it would find it. You'll notice now that we've got the hit highlighting on date time, but I could also do things like this. Visual Studio 2017 is much smarter about the way it handles capitalizations when I'm looking for autocomplete. So DT will, in capital letters, will intelligently pull up data template, date time, things like that. So this is going to be true everywhere when it comes to IntelliSense and autocomplete. But let's look at one of my favorite new features, and this is really a boon if you're trying to maintain some older code that had older versions of C#, for example, or older language versions that didn't understand some of the simplified initialization. So I've got this new model called user info. It's not really used necessarily in this app, but just to demonstrate it, this is pretty common to have an object for a user. It's got a first name, last name, region, birth date, age. Let's do find all references to find where it's used. We see the new cool find all references that show us exact locations. I see that I've got this user control. We can sort it by project, then definition. I've got this user control that's going to initialize a new user, and you'll see that I'm kind of doing this in an old-fashioned way. I new up a user info, and then I set a first name, last name, region, etc. One thing that I can do easily now in Visual Studio 2017 is simplify this initializer. So you'll notice that when I highlight that row, I've got my little light bulb that comes up and it says object initialization can be simplified. And it gives me an example of what could happen. I could say fix all occurrences in the document, and it'll actually show me what it's going to change that to. So now it's going to do it that way. I can say great. I could have also said do this in the entire project. Anything where user info got initialized will then be simplified that way. I could have added user and birth date in there and it would have done the same thing there, but I've split these out to demonstrate a couple of other things here that I think are pretty cool. The next one is this new idea of code styling. So nowadays in software development, there's this idea that I can do things a lot of different ways, but what's the best way? What kind of requirements do we have in our project, or what's the best practice, or what do the business rules say I have to do, or what do our code standards say? In Visual Studio 2017, we now have this new concept of code styling. So if I were just to go to the quick launch and say code style, I can bring up the general code style, and these are essentially rules. So the one that I'm going to focus on is this idea for var. So if you're sloppy like me, you've got used to using var, and var is great, where you don't have to have an explicit type. But I can create a rule that says for built-in types, always prefer the explicit type or prefer var, and make that a suggestion, a warning, or actually make it throw an error. So we could say this won't compile unless we do this. So for this example, I'm saying for built-in types, prefer the explicit type, and when the variable is a parent, when it's obvious I'm creating an int or a date time or whatever, prefer the explicit type, and also put that as a suggestion. If I were to look at this var, we really don't know what's coming back necessarily. I'm just creating this as a var. It's going to be a system string. But you notice how when I select that, I can now say use explicit type instead of var, and it'll change that for me. And we can do this really anywhere. So if I go back to our main page, we've got this var now on today's date. So it's pretty obvious that's a date time. This is a simplified example, but I can do the same thing here, where I can just say use explicit type instead of var. And so we can really manage these rules however we want. It's a really great way to enforce your coding rules and your standards, and to just give you a heads up on best practices. The next thing I want to look at is this idea of automatically adding braces. Now, if you're like me, you tend to get a little sloppy. If you came from the JavaScript world, you tend to do this as well. So we've got this if, else statement here, and everything's on one line. So a lot of people say, oh, I love to do this, whatever, but this is not ever recommended. So one thing that Visual Studio will do for us is we can actually just add braces and look at how it'll split that out. And of course, we could do that for the entire block. Also remove this qualification. It's saying, hey, this can be simplified. You don't really have to say this. It's not required. And I can just say remove this, and then it'll just set it to the background. This is really helpful to me. So I go in and maintain a lot of code for other people, or I'm trying to clean up code for other people to make it easier. Or maybe they've had a developer who's left in the middle of a contract. This makes it easy to come in and really intelligently clean up their code. Another thing that I like, that I found myself using a lot, since the async await pattern is still just a few years old with C# and other development languages, especially in Visual Studio, I still find that I have a habit of not naming my methods something async. So Visual Studio 2017 will actually tell me when I'm doing this, and then I need to take a look at my naming convention. So if I were to go over to my error list and take a look at my info, it says you've got a naming rule violation. You're missing the suffix async. So I've got this private async void load next fact we were just on. I could type async at the end so that it's named correctly, or I could just say fix the naming violation. And it changes this everywhere. Notice it changed it here and it changed it there. So that's pretty cool. It also says I've got an inline variable declaration that it doesn't like. So let's see what happens here. Remember here, I just had it simplify the initialization, but now if I wanted to try and parse a date, a try parse takes an out parameter. So this is typically the way you would have done it before Visual Studio 2017 and C#7. You'd say, okay, here's a date, and then I'm going to go out birth date. But watch what happens when I say inline variable declaration, fix all occurrences in the document. Notice how it's going to have an inline initializer, which is pretty cool. So now I could say try parse and I don't have to add the additional line of code. It's basically just this single line of code. It makes it an out variable and initializes it at the same time. Of course, this ought to be a date time as well, but you know, it might come back as something else. So var could be a smarter choice there. One more thing I wanted to look at when it comes to IntelliSense is just one addition that's been made to handle things a little bit better in JavaScript. If we pull up in this .NET Core portion of the project, this site.js, I can just start typing here and notice how we get this great autocomplete and IntelliSense that pops up now. And this is going to be true for a number of languages, not just C# and JavaScript and VB, but Python, some other scenarios. So it's fairly robust IntelliSense that is integrated into the environment no matter what you're doing. And this isn't just going to be generic the way that it was a lot of times in JavaScript with Visual Studio 2015. So pretty robust. Let's kind of change gears and look at a couple of things that are new around projects and publishing. Specifically, I want to look at some cool things that are enhancements and new features for UWP and desktop development, as well as some of the cool new features around publishing. And some of these are just changes, but one of them that I'm going to demonstrate is just a really neat new feature of publishing .NET Core apps, for example, in Visual Studio 2017. So we're back over in Visual Studio 2017 to take a look at some of the cool new and improved features around projects and publishing. Specifically, we're going to look at some of the XAML enhancements for UWP and desktop apps like WPF apps, as well as some of the new publishing dialog changes for things like .NET Core apps and some of the support that we have for going cross-platform with our publishing. So just as a refresher, you'll recall that we had this main page.xaml and we had this app that was going to pull up a random fact when we clicked a button. And you'll notice that when that loads, I've gone ahead and removed any of that UI. And I went ahead and stuck it in a user control under this controls folder. So you'll see that this is just a simple stack panel with a button and a text box. And if we go to the code behind, we'll see that this is just newing up that user. From the previous session, we're just getting a fact and we're just popping it into a text value of the label. So especially if you're working with solutions that have a lot of projects, and these custom controls or user controls can exist in a lot of different places. They could be in other projects, they could be external to the project now, be all over the place. You may not really know where these exist, but you know what they're called. We can now, for example, just type in the name of the control. I know that this is called Fact Viewer, and we'll get some assistance here that will just say add factmaster.controls. It'll intelligently go out and understand where that fact viewer would exist. I don't have to look it up in the toolbox or do anything else. The other thing that we can do here, just as we used to be able to do in 2015 with code behind, is I can say remove unnecessary namespaces. So I'll undo that and you'll notice how that was, you'll notice how that was dimmed out. That's a clue that that's an unnecessary, unused namespace. So I can just go ahead and remove that there. So that's pretty cool. Now if we run it, now we've got the control, and I can say get a fact. And there we go. Getty, did you know Mark Twain didn't even make it through elementary school? Great, get a fact. Grenades were invented in China. So one thing that I don't like about this is, you know, I've got it center justified horizontally and vertically. I don't like how it keeps moving it there. I think maybe I just need to give that a left alignment for the horizontal. But you know, I don't want to stop. I want to see how it looks first. So one of the cool new features for desktop apps in UWP is this ability to do XAML edit and continue. So in the past, we've had code behind edit and continue, but we haven't had XAML edit and continue. One of the cool ways to access that is to click to enable selection, and I could just select a specific element, and then I can bring up the live visual tree. And when I select the properties there, you'll notice that it's going to take me to the specific XAML behind the scenes. So I can say horizontal alignment here, left, and if I go over to my app, you'll notice how it's already justified left. Now that's all the way over. Let's put a margin on that. So I'll say margin 40 and pull that up. And you'll notice how that's all real time. So just to confirm, I'm running. This is edit continue while I'm in run mode. And I can do all kinds of things here. It really doesn't matter. And this can affect any of your visualizations. This can affect any of your styling. This can affect really any XAML that you need to change on the fly while you're still in run mode. And this is a big deal when you're trying to go across different form factors. And hey, this looks too big, this looks too small. And this whole idea that you have to continue to stop, make a change, rerun, just update your XAML is really pretty cumbersome. The new edit and continue for XAML really gives us the ability to see exactly what this is going to look like without having to stop the code. We could have very complex code that has to get loaded up before we would get to this point. Now we don't even have to worry about it. We can just change it on the back end and everything is smooth. Let's take a look at how we would publish in Visual Studio 2017. Let's go ahead and make this .NET Core app the startup project. And we'll just run that so that we get a feel for that. We'll load that up in IIS Express. And we'll just see that this is just a plain vanilla .NET Core app running on localhost now 25735. So this should look familiar to anybody who's done .NET Core. This is just using an MVC template as well. So if we were to say publish now, and we could publish to a new profile, notice how we have these two choices. We have a Microsoft Azure App Service and a Microsoft Azure Virtual Machine. So we have these two new features in publishing where we can actually publish it out directly. This is an enhancement from Visual Studio 2015, where we would have to then go select an Azure app and go through it that direction. Now we just have a nice clear button to select for an Azure App Service or an Azure Virtual Machine, and it'll actually connect to a virtual machine, or we can create one as well. But it gets a little bit cooler than that. So that functionality was kind of available already, but one thing that wasn't really available so smoothly was this ability to say, I've got this .NET Core app and I want to publish this out to Linux. I want to have a Linux VM spun up, or I want to have it a Docker container. If we're using a Docker container, there's great advantages over a VM. But there used to be this cumbersome process of having to possibly go out to Docker Hub, and you're doing a lot of command lines. You're going to have to, where am I going to go after this? Am I going to go to Azure Container Service? I mean, there's a lot of working pieces in that. Now what we can do, first and foremost, is simply just say add Docker project support. Now, in previous versions, we had Docker support that we would add, but it was basically just adding that as a project. There wasn't any orchestration. If we had multiple projects in our solution that needed orchestration or some kind of a compose model, we couldn't really do it easily, or it wasn't as effective. But now we can just say add Docker project support. And if we wait for a couple of seconds here, it's going to add some new files, one of them being the infamous Docker file. There we go. You see how this Docker file gets created. We also have in our launch settings file this new node that gets added for Docker. Now this is going to match up to our run dropdown. So notice now we have that we can run an IIS. We can just run the web in a console with a program.cs, or you can run it in Docker. So I'm just going to run that in Docker. This is actually going to spin up a VM, a Linux VM. In fact, while that's pulling that up, we can just pull up Hyper-V here. And you'll notice we have this little VM here, Moby Linux VM, that is actually running, and it's using the CPU out there. So this is actually running on Linux at this point. We have a different port, but this is actually running on Linux on our Windows machine. So we've been able to do variations of this up until now, but one thing that we couldn't do easily was just say, you know what, I just want this out to a Linux VM somewhere. I just want this in a Docker container, an instance of this image in a Docker container somewhere out in Azure, for example. Now we can just say publish, and notice when we say new profile, we have this Azure App Service Linux preview. So if we select that, this gives us the ability to publish this to Azure, and the Visual Studio 2017 will do all the heavy lifting for us to provision everything. So we could say we want this web app to be called FactMaster. We'll just put this in Connect Resources out there. We'll just keep that plan. It's going to ask us also for a container registry. This is something that it's not exactly the way that it works, but it sort of takes the place of having to go out to a Docker Hub. We have this container registry. And so now if we say create, it's going to have a little bit of a delay. Going to create those elements out in Azure. And now you'll notice that we have this profile that's been created. Once this profile has been created, if we say publish, this is actually going to publish this out to Linux. So this is going to be running in a Docker container in Linux, which is very, very, very cool. So if I say publish now, you'll notice that the first time we do this, we've got a little bit of a startup. And there we go. So that .NET Core solution has been pushed out to Azure and is running in a Docker container on Linux. And there we go, it's loaded up. You'll notice that there's a little bit of a delay from the time the publish happens to the time it loads, because it's actually restarting that server out there before it loads up. So that's pretty cool. Let's take a look at one more thing when it comes to publishing, and this is an area that's pretty near and dear to my heart. If we go back to that UWP solution, one of the biggest pains is creating assets for publishing in the package app manifest. The visual assets has been updated now to give us the ability to use the asset generator. So the concept here is that I create a visual asset that is a single asset, and then Visual Studio 2017 will create the variations of those assets for me. Now there are scenarios where we wouldn't necessarily want to use this, but in general this is an extremely handy feature, because this way I don't have to create 30 or 50 different versions and resolutions and scales. So I can just say source and select a tile, and then for scales I can say all recommended scales. For assets I'm going to do everything. Realistically, I might want to undo splash screen and create a different splash screen for it, but just for demonstration purposes, you'll see how nice this is that we can select all of those. And to confirm, here's what we have for assets right now. We have all of these ugly sort of squares with the box through it. So if I say generate, it's going to say these are all going to be overwritten. That's fine. And you'll notice now how quick that was. It populated all of our assets based on this single 400 by 400 pixel PNG file. So now if we load this up, You'll notice that splash screen image is kind of small there. That's why we typically want to create a different splash screen. But at least we don't see that big ugly box with an X. You'll see down here in the taskbar, we've got the new icon there. Everywhere we've got that icon needed, we've got that new asset that's been generated for us. So this is really helpful. This actually expedites the publishing process tremendously. So pretty cool, and this applies not just to UWP, but if we're going to push this stuff over using the bridge or using a scenario where we can ready a legacy app for Universal Windows Platform and publish it to the store, that'll work as well. All right, pretty cool. So a bunch of really cool new features and enhancements for UWP, XAML, desktop, and especially publishing. So we've covered quite a bit of content in this session, and if you're like me, you'll want to get out and start experimenting with some of these features right away, as well as discovering more enhancements and cool new features on your own. Look for more Visual Studio 2017 sessions coming available soon as Visual Studio moves through its release cycles. I'm Scott J. Peterson, and this has been What's New and Improved in Visual Studio 2017.